All right. That's Gloria's band singing Grand Cross. She used to be a singer and headliner of her band. It was a good time in her life. I'm sure she has a great. We probably should do a show where we just talk to her about that experience. She probably got some really good stories. Anyway, hi, I am Cheese Slice. I am the engineer and producer of Uncontrolled Opposition. And today it's going to be just Gloria and Jeremy as we talk about the CIA and its infiltration into higher education. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. Let's go ahead and bring on Jeremy and Gloria. Hi, Jeremy, and
Hi.
hello, Gloria.
Hey, Jamie. Hey, Jeremy.
We'll get you guys in the right order there so I can cue you up properly for the show. But I know you guys are going to have a good discussion today. We're going to, for the viewers at home, if this is the first time you've watched this show, we are a radio show, but we're just recording it live so you get to see the production and stuff like that, all the behind the scenes stuff. And we record about an hour, and then I will edit this video, and it'll go up on WBAI in New York and also the Progressive Radio Network. So, without further ado, Gloria, take it away.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle mind wars with truth strikes. I'm Gloria Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jamie Cheeseslice. The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guest, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. We keep hearing that universities are temples of truth. Jeremy's series on CIA infiltration shows that they really are extensions of Langley. We'll attempt to cover 9 of his articles today. If not, we will make the ones we didn't discuss into a series with a part 2. Consider that in universities, the CIA provides cover for Pentagon research and development (R&D) programs, recruits students for careers in military intelligence, conducts MKULTRA mind control experiments on unwitting students. A famous one is the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, cultivates an idealized image of the predator class and its operatives. Think about the so-called great men in government and industry that we were taught about starting in kindergarten. Rewrite history and current events to align with State Department narratives that justify Western imperialism. We learn to equate the concept of civilization with conquest, slavery, and theft because the natives were being educated in Western traditions and religion by missionaries. Right. As David W. Kond wrote in his suppressed 1970s book, CIA, Core of the Cancer, academic gatekeepers, those who receive foundation money or work directly for CIA-linked organizations, are part of a system of intellectual incest and rape. He didn't hold back. The rapists define the parameters of discourse and censor real intellectuals who genuinely speak truth to power. The 9 articles we will discuss are American Committee on Foreign Relations miseducates public and censors truth-telling analysts, the Asia Foundation's Deep CIA Ties Exposed, as students go back to school, what pivotal aspects of U.S. history, including CIA history, will not be taught. 4, Stanford Center gives journalism award to CIA-linked media outlet involved in Bangladesh regime change. 5, CIA Cold War experiments shatter the lives of countless unwitting victims. 6, Harvard promotes another warmonger to its faculty. MIT, the Pentagon on the Charles, is deeply complicit in the Israeli genocide and Ukraine war atrocities that threaten World War III. 8, Harvard Kennedy School's Misinformation Review promotes its own information. 9. Meet a forgotten CIA critic who presently characterized the agency as a cancer in a 1970s book. Before we begin, let's take a look back in time. In Greece, 399 BC, Socrates was tried for corrupting the youth. His real offense was questioning Athenian war policy and elite slave ownership. And how much has changed? The state didn't debate him, it executed him by hemlock. In Rome in 93 CE, the emperor expelled all philosophers for questioning the imperial exploitation of the provinces. It was later written, they banish the teachers so the lies can live. By 100 CE, the Praetorian Guard enforced official history by replacing Cicero-style speeches against tyranny with imperial edicts. Dissenters were executed for condemning corruption. Same pattern, bigger budget. Athens poisoned the questioner. Rome either exiled or executed their critics. Today's Ivy League withholds tenure, retracts articles, and funnels Pentagon grants. The curriculum is the new hemlock: slow, quiet, and legal. We're not asking for balance. We're demanding the syllabus stop redacting our empire's crimes. Thank you. To start off, Jeremy, please tell us about the American Committee on Foreign Relations and how it miseducates the public and censors truth-telling analysts. Thank you.
There's actually another article I want to add to that list on Dr. Wesley Fischel. I think I forgot to send to you, who is a CIA agent and political science professor at Michigan State University, who is a key figure in the escalation of the Vietnam War and was rightfully targeted by anti-war protesters in the 60s and early 70s. And I think that's what we need to see today, the evolution of this pro-Palestine movement on campus into a larger anti-imperialist movement that target the imperialist nature of the academy and that target professors and institutions on the campuses that are complicit in more crime than U.S. empire, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. And I can give some suggestions of professors to be targeted. But to answer your question, corrupt professors, of course, there are some good ones. I don't want to say it's all bad. I had a lot of good teachers that inspired me. At the same time, I think certain topics I did have to learn more on my own in my own education. As far as the Committee on Foreign Relations, this is a very important and sinister organization that people should be aware of. And what I advocated for in my article is that progressives like us form our own counter institution that tries to that does what the American Committee on Foreign Relations claims to be doing. We should actually try and do ourselves. What they claim to be doing is to be promoting education about U.S. foreign policy in the Midwest, in kind of middle America, not in the New York or California, Los Angeles, but in smaller cities in the Midwest that are maybe more traditionally provincial cities, to bring out speakers and promote dialogue and education about U.S. foreign policy, which is a very noble goal. Unfortunately, this committee is an offshoot of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is known as Wall Street's think tank, and was funded by some of the wealthiest Americans going back to the early 20th century. And arch imperialist figures were associated with that. Institutions such as Elihu Root, who was a key architect of the Philippine War. I think he was one of the co-founders or first directors, and then figures like George Kennan and Henry Kissinger, heavyweights in U.S. foreign policy, and the Dulles brothers were associated with it. And Morgan, a lot of the financing came from a big Wall Street firm like J.P. Morgan that have traditionally been the basically key drivers of aggressive U.S. militaristic foreign policy that benefit their own business interests. So they funded this council as a kind of think tank to basically promote their worldview that would lend public support to interventionist foreign policy that have caused many wars and disasters around the world. And Charles Beard, in the 20s and 30s, Charles Beard was a academic at Columbia who had an alternative vision of foreign policy. And of course, they blacklisted him. So that's the pattern. They blacklist, instead of promoting dialogue and education, they promote their vision, American world domination and, spreading capitalism and free markets around the world as the noble end of U.S. foreign policy. And they frame narratives kind of in the way that the U.S. government usually frames them, and bring out those kind of speakers. And they don't encourage debate. And I learned that firsthand when I joined the Tulsa Committee. And I asked, there was a forum where we could suggest speakers for the year. So I suggested some members of the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity. And I specifically picked, insiders, former government officials. But they're more on the dissenting end. They've written critically about the manipulation of intelligence, manipulation of public opinion, and critical of various wars like Iraq and Ukraine war. And that was shot down. I went to a planning meeting as well, and I asked the chair if I can have some of my speakers, and I also said there should be more voices from the global South. And he just kind of sneered at me and said, "Oh, they're left-wing people, and we promote a centrist view and responsible," something like to that effect. And that was that. And of course, I was never invited, even though I published numerous books and articles and journals. I was teaching at a university, and I knew the guy because he was in political science, and he had been the president of that university. And I sent him notice of some of my books, and I would have been, I was highly qualified to speak before that group. And usually I do well with audiences. I was invited to different groups in town occasionally to speak, and my talk went over well. In fact, a lot of the audience were very critical of U.S. foreign policy, but they refused me at this group and refused, sneered at my speaker choices. And it showed they were censoring that kind of view. And, if you look up their website, they have these, committees in many different cities. But if you look at the board members, some are connected directly to intelligence agencies. This guy who's running the one in my city was the president of the University of Tulsa. And it's listed on his website that he's a consultant for U.S. intelligence agencies. And I mean, I looked at Dallas one. They had all these people also tied with intelligence agencies running it. And one was on the board of the Sixth Floor Museum, which promotes the official narrative that Oswald was the lone assassin and censors, any critical investigation into the Kennedy assassination. So you're never going to get a lot. It shows how they censor, and these committees. It's for the public, but they're also connected with various universities, and they often run programs in universities as well. They bring the same speaker. That's what's going on. In Tulsa, they would bring the speaker to the university as well to speak with students. So they're only bringing certain kinds of speakers who are promoting the U.S. foreign policy line. And like in the last year, well, they kind of came out in the open, because in the last year, he brought in an actual CIA agent who, surprise, surprise, had association with the university, I believe, OSU. And she was a CIA agent, and she was basically talking about how her job was to manipulate people in foreign countries. And then some people at the end they asked who wants to join the CIA, and they brought students. They also bring high school students, and like a lot of high school students wanted to join the CIA. She presented in a very heroic, adventurous light. And then they also brought some NED people. National Endowment for Democracy is an offshoot of the CIA that promotes propaganda and destabilization in countries targeted by the U.S. for regime change. And this was a time that Trump was threatening to cut the budget. So he brought 2 NED spokesmen to basically defend the NED and lobby for more aid to the NED. So he kind of came out in the open this year that it's an open intelligence front. And he was, the speaker they brought were from these insider of the Beltway think tanks. And he was, how basically presenting one, like how it's great struggle for Ukrainian democracy, and then they brought in the Ukrainian consul. And I was like, well, if you want real education, bring the Ukrainian, and then the next month bring the Russian, and let the public really understand both sides of a conflict. I mean, that's what I try and do in education. And students, not that I'm God gifted teaching, but I've taught for 20 years, and I've constantly gotten positive feedback from students. Even students I see around town, they constantly thank me for exposing them just to different sides of things. And that is my approach, a side they don't get in the media and in the mainstream and probably in their other courses. But that's my approach to conflict, both sides. If the Korean War, we have to look at the North Korean perspective, South Korean, and then you develop a more rounded perspective. So if you want to cover the Russia-Ukraine conflict, you have to give weight to both sides, and then people could have a fuller understanding. But this group is not doing that. So it's not an education group. It's promoting propaganda for the Ukrainian government, which, as we know, is a very bad government that has outlawed 12 parties, that has killed a lot of its opponents, that has sent its own youth to their death in provoking a conflict that could have been easily avoidable, and that's selling its country's economy to Wall Street and foreign interests. It's a highly unpopular government, so they're giving a platform for it. And on the Middle East, they brought in a guy who had worked with Elliot Abrams, who went on podcasts with Elliot Abrams, a CIA agent who's an Iran-Contra felon and an extreme right-winger. And he was blaming Iran. After October 7th, he said Iran was behind it, and they're drumming up support for a war in Iran. So it really functioned as a warmongering organization, and it's not educating. It's miseducating the public, and it's censoring legitimate voices of dissent and real education.
Oh, okay. Just for brevity's sake, we need to get on to the Asia Foundation and its deep CIA ties exposed.
Well, the Asia Foundation, and this is an excellent book by David Price. It's easier to document going back in history because he was able to review the records of the Asia Foundation from the Cold War years, and they had, I guess, denied any CIA connection. But this is a foundation that supports educational initiatives and programs and some development projects, in Southeast Asia, and supports academics and academic research and books. And it turned out, they got their funding from the CIA, a lot of it, and that some of their staff were functioning as intelligence agents, and that their reports were being sent to the CIA, and they were being used as part of counterinsurgency operations, like in Vietnam, to win the hearts and minds. They were setting up schools after, forcing peasants off their land. And then they set up these schools, and they were promoting like educational program to advance anti-communist, American exceptionalist ideology. And they're bringing speakers like in Harvard. They were involved with Henry Kissinger's class at Harvard, and it promoted, the U.S. position in the Cold War and demonized the Soviet Union and any, left-wing governments and political economic system. So they help warp. It's another organization that helps warp higher education in the United States, as well as in foreign countries. It basically spreads U.S. propaganda under the guise of education. And, I did a study on Barack Obama, my book, and I looked at his, one of the chapters, was dealing with his background, and it covered his education in Columbia and the kind of courses he took. And, he was commenting, he did take a course in like Eastern Europe, and he just said, it presented these countries in the worst of light. And, it was totally demonizing socialist societies. That course Obama took, and that's characteristic of the education system, where these governments are just thoroughly demonized, and socialism is equated with evil, and it's all negative. And when you have, I've read a lot of the books, and I'm not an expert, but I have read books, and there are negative things that should be covered. But it's not a balance. If I can just finish my sentence, it's not a balanced portrait, because there are books I've read, like a guy who lived in East Germany, acknowledged bad things in East Germany, but also talked about some of the positive things in East German society, whether it was the free education, free healthcare, etc. So, a balanced approach would actually weigh both the positive and negatives, and why there's some nostalgia today. If you go in Eastern Europe, which I have, and talk to people, there's a lot of nostalgia for the communist era among the older generation. But the courses that people are offered here don't offer, from my assessment, a balance. They just demonize it. And that's, a lot of the funding in the past came from the Asia Foundation. These scholars who were experts on communist states were funded by Asia Foundation or CIA link groups. Go ahead. Sorry to.
It was a long
I just
one.
wanted to finish what I was saying. Yeah.
I got it. It's just I want to go to our audience for a minute and just say, we hear the word socialist, and to the left, socialist is like this amazing thing, and to the right, it's this curse. It's this horrible thing, and neither really, is appropriate. I mean, when we say the word social, okay, it's an orientation more for the rights of individuals to receive enough income to support their families, to have a good quality education for their children, to have clean and decent, affordable housing, uh, access to pure drinking water, and uncontaminated food. I mean, when they say, "Oh, it's socialist," it's bad. It's silly. It really is. It's just we need to get away from this concept of these political dynamics, and just go right into what these things really are. They're for human rights. And everyone, whether you're, a Republican or a Democrat, or you're left or you're right, everyone should be in favor of human rights. I mean, everyone wants, a good home for their children, and a good education. So, when we hear the word socialism, let's not be misled by people who are using that word to gain our votes, but actually not doing anything that helps us. And let's also, when people say it's a terrible thing, also say, well, wait, you're using socialism for the banks. You're using socialism for all of these corporations are getting these handouts and these giveaways and all of these things, but yet, workers are being repressed and getting less. So, I just wanted to put that out there. And then the next one that we'll be discussing, because
Well, if I
we've
can
got
briefly
9.
add a point on that, as far
Okay,
as a
go ahead.
course on the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe or China or North Korea under communism, you have to look at the historical context in which those systems emerged, the failing of the old order, and also how the communists were also nationalistic and trying to reclaim sovereignty over their economy. And often that's lacking in the kind of education that's received with Asia Foundation scholar. There's a pure demonization of the Soviet Union, not looking at the impetus behind the Russian Revolution, why it endured. So, I mean, I think any objective analysis has to cover that, and students are not getting objective analysis. And, the Harvard article I've done went into how the Russian field was dominated. It was like a mafia led by people like Zbigniew Brzezinski and Richard Pipes, who was a professor at Harvard. And they said he was so conservative, he valorized the czarist government, and he worked for the Reagan administration and supported, hyper aggressive Cold War policies. And Pipes and Brzezinski were Poles, and the Poles have a historic rivalry with the Soviet Union and Russians, and they were not objective at all. They presented the Soviet Union in the worst of possible light, and they controlled the entire field. They not only taught at Harvard and the Ivy League schools for years, they controlled the field as far as job appointments, academic publishing in that field. So people who had a more objective and rounded assessment were basically blacklisted, with this anti-communist, ultra-conservative mafia running that field. And that's, unfortunately, it led to the miseducation of generations of Americans, including the elite universities.
Well, you need to have a bogeyman to justify the suffering back home. You can say, oh, well, we can give you less because we're fighting against communism, or we can give you less because we're fighting against Hamas, so we can give you less. I mean, there's always a bogeyman that justifies our domestic repression. and communism fit that mold. And whether it was good or bad is irrelevant. It was a useful bogeyman. So let's go on to number 3. As students go back to school, what pivotal aspects of U.S. history, including CIA history, will not be taught?
Well, yeah, I hope people will consult this article. It's a long article, and there are many things they won't be taught. I can give some highlights. One that angers me is the Vietnam War. There's been this vogue of historical revisionism that basically rewrites the whole history and distorts the history of the Vietnam War to present American allies in the war as honorable. And they cloak it in this kind of liberal rhetoric of decolonizing history and presenting more Vietnamese point of view. But really, they're presenting the view of the South Vietnamese government and valorizing the South Vietnamese government and underplaying its horrific atrocity that government committed and how dependent. They kind of admit, like there's a book by Edward Miller of Dartmouth University that is at the forefront of this revisionism. He's, of course, Harvard trained. And, if you read the book, there's data buried in it that government would depend, basically the U.S. bankrolled its army and provided something like $2 billion in aid to that government, which would not stand a day without U.S. support. And yet he's trying to claim that they were independent, they had a strong base, and they were nationalistic, and they could have won the war, and it was more of an internal Vietnamese struggle, and they were honorable, and they depicted North Vietnamese revolutionaries as the bad guys, in this kind of Cold War demonology. And they basically recycle the CIA talking points of the 50s and 60s that the South was defending the country against North Vietnamese communist aggression. And meanwhile, there's a new book by James Bradley, who lived for years, and he's the son of the man who raised the flag at Iwo Jima, and he's a scholar of Southeast Asia himself, and he's lived in Vietnam for years, and he just published a new book that totally undercut their argument. And he said, the Vietnamese always saw themselves as one country. And this revisionist wave is trying to argue for this viable, independent South Vietnamese state that America was legitimately defending. And some even claim American troops behaved honorably. And this guy at San Diego State University, Pierre Asselin, attacks the Bertrand Russell, who held hearings on war crimes and got testimony from many Vietnamese and American soldiers and many people. And it's a great historical document of the horrific atrocities committed in Vietnam. And this San Diego professor is telling his students that Bertrand Russell was, a communist stooge, and his tribunal is bad. And he leaves out all these books. So many books have been published to document the history of the Vietnam War and how bad it is, and yet he leaves that all out of his history. So that's just one example. They're distorting the history of the Vietnam to make it look like a...
I'd also like to mention to our audience that we did a show. I think we might have done it under Left on Left. I'm not sure if we were on ops at that point, Uncontrolled Opposition, but we did a show on Ken Burns's film on Vietnam, and we really went into a lot of detail as to the falsehoods that Ken Burns represented. And we corrected them. So, I'd let our audience know. You can find our shows on YouTube and Rumble, and we're also on Podbeam. So if you'd like to, look at what Ken Burns presented as a filmmaker and a documentary filmmaker and what we saw as wrong with it, you can check out that episode. Okay, let's go on to number.
I could talk all day because there's, and I'll just I'll get back to you. But like the Kennedy assassination, the Harvard guy, is quoted in the New York Times saying, "Oh, it was Oswald, the lone assassin." And he just shuts out. There's dozens and dozens of books with a massive amount of detail showing how Oswald could not have been the assassin, and there was clearly a wider conspiracy. But he ignores, although those are conspiracy theorists. And they just, students are being taught the official narrative that absolved the CIA and the Johnson involved in the JFK assassination. They cover up a lot of CIA atrocities all around the world. There are few courses on the CIA offered, and in the Foreign Relations Journal, the Society of Historian of American Foreign Relations Journal, they had an article, "Oh, the CIA, a force for peace." So anyway, go on.
A piece for us and none for you. Okay, I think on number 4 we have Stanford Center gives journalist award to CIA-linked media outlet involved in Bangladesh regime change.
Well, yeah, and Stanford, had these institutes, the Freeman Spogli, and I would urge students, one of the professors there, Michael McFaul, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and one of the leading Cold Warriors and figures, championing the U.S. war in Ukraine and the million of death that has resulted in. So that's the kind of professors, and I reviewed their Southeast Asian department, and they teach nothing on U.S. Imperialism in Southeast Asia. And they present the North Korean threat, and they don't explain, like what I was saying, they don't give a historical context, explain how the North Korean regime evolved as it did, how the Korean War impacted it, the horrific atrocities and devastating bombing the U.S. carried out in North Korea. That's obscure in the kind of courses that appear to be offered at Stanford. And then they're giving a journalism award to a CIA-funded outlet that supported the color revolution in Bangladesh. And they basically, champion this regime led by a Clinton major donor to the Clinton Foundation and darling, Muhammad Yunus, who actually, he developed this system. He's now the president, head of state in Bangladesh. He was put in, and he championed these microfinance loans that the global elite loved because it was a way to fight poverty without having to have leftist policies that redistributed wealth and that reined in corporations and their abuses. His formula was to just give loans for small businesses, but in fact his bank fleeced people and thrust many people into heavy debt and bankruptcy because he only gave them like 10 days to repay the loan, and who could build a business in 10 days? And he charged huge interest rates, and many were forced into destitution because of him. So he's a crook and a con man. And now he was put in as head of state in this color revolution in Bangladesh. And he's also empowered Islamic extremists in the country who've carried out pogroms against Hindus. And the National Endowment for Democracy, because the government that they overthrew was more pro-China and was resisted U.S. efforts to establish military bases there. So they got rid of her. And now they have this pro-capitalist, pro-U.S. leader who's also empowering Islamic fundamentalists. And the National Endowment for Democracy funded this news outlet, Netra News, that promoted incendiary propaganda against the old regime led by Sheikh Hasina, who happened to have been the daughter of Bangladesh's founder. And it's not journalism. A journalism school gave this a degree. And in my article, I said that's a disgrace because a journalism, you're trained to be objective, to try and get both sides of a story, to present different sources and a rounded perspective to readers. And there is a difference in journalism school, and I have some training in journalism. You do learn the difference between political propaganda versus journalism, and there is a big and important difference. So why is a journalism school awarding a propaganda outlet? And I surveyed the Netra News, and all the features of a propaganda, not a news outlet. They didn't seek different sides of a story and different sources, and they stirred up hatred against a particular government. And yes, there were some abuses of that government, but they didn't cover the abuses of the Yunus government after it took over, nor critically cover his background. They heroized him. So it was a propaganda, not journalistic outlet. And so a journalism school should not, as I said, award a propaganda outlet, because that goes against the teaching of the school. It's a disgrace, and let alone a disgrace of a magazine, an outlet that fueled this violent insurrection in the country, and it's devastated the country. So this is an outrage. And I wrote a letter to the Stanford Daily, but I never heard back from the editors there.
Not surprised. Okay, number 5. CIA Cold War experiments shatter lives of countless victims.
Well, this has come out over time how involved, and and I'm not just promoting these theories. This is documented evidence of much of what I'm saying. For instance, with the CIA MKUltra, the George Washington University has the National Security Archive, which sues the government for the release of classified documents, and they've got an excellent display on the MKUltra and a lot of documents that show the great connection between the MKUltra, how they used U.S. universities to carry out those experiments, and how these top psychiatrists and psychologists were working for the CIA to carry out unethical experiments, sometimes on students, and funded through the universities. And these were the kind of experiments where they were, they were trying to find like Cold War truth serum and ways to manipulate the mind. And they were testing drugs unwittingly on people. And they were doing this sometimes in prisons. And they were using prisoners as guinea pigs. And one of the prisoners who experienced that was Whitey Bulger, the notorious gangster. And he wrote about it, how he was part of this experiment, and they gave him LSD for like 70 days in a row, and large doses of LSD, and it really messed with his brain. And I mean, even if he was a criminal, it's still it's an abuse of various laws and ethical standards. So many different universities were implicated. The University of Oklahoma, my alma mater, McGill University, and this is well known by now, the kind of experiments that went on there with Ewan Cameron and various
the sleep room.
Yeah, they were torturing people, and they were testing various interrogation methods, and many people were severely tortured through these experiments funded by the CIA, carried out under the veneer of great universities.
So let's go on to number 6. Harvard promotes another warmonger to its faculty, hires Sullivan as Kissinger's professor while it... Oops. Go ahead on that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Harvard faculty is filled with warmongers. One is Samantha Power, who I think is back on the faculty of the Carr Human Rights School. And, she wrote the book. She was the key architect of the Libyan war that was, as bad for Libya as the Iraq war was for Iraq. It plunged that country back to the dark ages, basically. Was designed to, steal its oil resources. And she was a key figure in the Obama administration behind that. And she wrote a book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. And I carried out a review of that book, and I found that to be a work of fraud and also a very low intellectual standard, that if I were her professor or thesis advisor, I would send her back to the library to do some actual real research. And the first chapter, for example, valorizes a war propagandist named Henry Morgenthau, who spread propaganda about the Turks and their atrocities. Now, there was some truth to the propaganda, but there was an ulterior agenda because the Turks were allied with Germany, and it was more he was trying to get U.S. to become involved in World War I, and she presents him as a hero. And World War I cost 100,000 American lives and was a disaster. If the U.S. had been a peace broker, that might have prevented the rise of Adolf Hitler, because they could have worked out some kind of peace settlement instead of ultimately the Versailles Treaty, the punitive treaty against Germany that was grossly unjust, angered the Germans and led to, Hitler seized on that to rise to power in Germany. So if the U.S. had actually been a peace broker, instead of going into the war with the Allies to attack Germany and then punish Germany after, World War II and Hitler could have been prevented. And she's heroizing this war propagandist, Henry Morgenthau, in her first chapter. Other chapters cover conflict like Rwanda. For instance, that chapter was totally wrong. Her analysis of the conflict, it presents this cartoonish view of the Tutsi as victim and Hutu as these evil bad guys, and why didn't America save the Tutsi? In fact, America was supporting the Tutsi and intervened militarily in Rwanda. It was a regime change operation to bring in power the Tutsi and then arm them as they invaded Congo, so the U.S. corporation could access the mineral wealth in the Congo. But she evades any discussion of political economy and corporate and economic interests driving U.S. policies, and distorts conflict. So I'd give her a D as a professor, a D or an F, and yet this work was celebrated, and she was given this appointment at Harvard. So what are students learning from somebody like her? And then she goes to work from the administration as the chief war hawk. In fact, the military, we're trying to avoid the war in military. Normally we think of the military, the hawks. She was so hawkish that she was way more hawkish than the people in the military, the top levels, who are usually the hawks. And she's been exposed as a fraud because she's all for human rights, and then when the Israeli genocide in Gaza, she was completely silent. Because her book is supposed to be about why in America they have to go in to stop genocide, and then there's a genocide going on in Gaza, and she's not calling for any military intervention to save the Palestinians. So everybody sees her now as a fraud, and yet she's this distinguished professor at Harvard for years. So what are students learning? And then there's a whole lineage I go into. Sam Huntington, he was tied with the Elite Trilateral Commission. He wrote an article in support of bombing the Vietnamese countryside so they could have an urban revolution, force all the peasants into the city, and then throw them consumer gadgets, and they'll turn to capitalism. He wrote an article about that, supporting the bombing of the Vietnamese countryside. And he was the distinguished political science professor for years at Harvard. I can go on and on and on. McGeorge Bundy was the CIA's liaison to the White House, another key architect of the Vietnam War. He was the dean at Harvard.
Okay, so then we're up to, let's see, MIT. The Pentagon on the Charles is complicit in Israeli genocide and Ukraine war atrocities that threaten World War III.
Well, and the student Palestine movement, to their credit, did some research about MIT's connection to the Israeli military and found that a number of professors were getting contract from the Israeli Defense Ministry to develop drones and drone swarms that was used to terrorize the Palestinians. And unfortunately, they weren't digging into the university's ties to Ukraine war as well. And that was out in the open just through some research on the internet. I was just reading through some MIT newsletters and I guess Alumni Magazine that was available online. And I find an article that basically was reporting favorably and enthusiastically about a covert operation being run out of MIT to support the Ukraine war. It was these students, MIT students, and I think a few were graduates and some were still students, who had developed this efficient computer system for getting the weapons to the front line more efficiently. And they were bragging about this and how these students were helping the Ukrainian military with a better organizational system for their weapons so they could kill more Russian than kill more Eastern Ukrainians. And, I would advise people to watch Patrick Lancaster, an American naval veteran who's been filming the atrocities committed by the Ukrainian military over the last since the Maidan coup of 2014. So we know those weapons are being used to kill sometimes civilians and many people in Eastern Ukraine and Russian, and it's provoking the Russians to potentially why their war. And MIT is celebrating this in their alumni newsletter, their students, and many of whom are military. It's said they're in the military or tied with intelligence agencies. And then they have a Ukraine program at MIT, and there's a history professor, I believe her name is Rosemary Wood, running it. And I looked up her scholarship, and it's this cartoonish scholarship, like what I was saying, how how Brzezinski and the Pipes cover Soviet Russia. It's not an objective assessment. And yes, we do agree there are bad things. There were abuses in the Soviet Union, and that should be discussed and taught to students. It should be sugar-coated that that system worked perfectly, that there weren't atrocities. But an objective assessment looks again at the historical forces behind the Russian Revolution, looks at some of the program that led to the improvements in society and why people supported it for a long time. That has to be factored into an objective assessment. It's not what you get, unfortunately, with those kind of professors. And Rosemary Wood follows in that pattern because her scholarship was just an attack on Vladimir Putin without any objectivity. And Putin, you know, there are bad things about him, but an objective assessment will also have to look at why Russians support him, a lot of them, and how he restored certain economic sovereignty after the rule of Boris Yeltsin. But she doesn't do that, nor does she look at U.S.-Ukrainian provocations that led to the Ukraine war. It's all about evil Russia, the aggressor, no nuance. It's basically completely Russophobic. And unfortunately, that it's, you know, it's cloaked in an expertise, and you know, students are not learning objectively about that region of the world with that kind of professor, and that's what concerns me. And also, they function as a mafia to basically blacklist anybody who tries to present a more nuanced perspective. Can't get a job, can't get the tenure. They may be able to hang on as a poorly paid adjunct, but they have to work in other. They can only do that part time.
There's also, you know, I could tell a personal story. There's also, you know, the way they control students. I had a very good undergraduate education at SUNY Westbury, and a lot of my professors were activists and economists and you know, that type of thing. So I really did get a good education. And then I went to NYU graduate school on a scholarship, and you know, I got this paper to write on a book that was given to me by the dean, who was Alan Altshuler, and it was a book by this author E.S. Savas, and it was called "Privatizing the Public Sector." And I was a student in the graduate program for government, and it basically said that they wanted to privatize everything. And my argument was that this was just a way to cut funding. And with these block, it was all about block grants versus like kind of narrow grants. And I was saying that the whole block grant thing was basically a way to give less money. And you gave a little bit more freedom in how it's spent, but it was less money. And you know, I had like a, I don't know, a 4.0 average. I was on a scholarship there, which isn't easy to get. And he gave me like, I think, a B minus on that paper because I he didn't like my argument. He wanted me to support the book, and he wanted us all to support the book. And if we wrote supporting the book, we would have got, you know, the A. So I was so upset that I, you know, went to his office, and I wanted to argue the grade and this and everything. And you know, he was just such so fake, and you know, basically had no argument, you know, to counter me. But you know, I think he did raise my grade slightly to a B instead of a B minus or something like that after like an hour. Well, not even an hour, probably like 10 minutes. It felt like an eternity. And then next thing I know, he became the dean of Harvard's Kennedy School. So you know, they love these types that are trying to program students. And you know, and if you don't, as a student, follow the you know, the line that they want you to follow, they will not give you the grades. And so it's you know, bad from a, you know, professor standpoint that you'll get fired, you won't get tenure. But it's also, you know, bad for a student if you do think and you do your own analysis, and it's not the analysis that they want you to have. They will punish you with a grade. And you know, fortunately, my grades were real well. It didn't affect my funding or anything like that. So it'll, you know, all well that ends well. But you know, that's just my personal experience as a student in this. Jeremy, let's move on to, I think, number 8, and that's Harvard Kennedy School's misinformation.
Yeah, I mean, this, again shows, I think, a decline, because I think there was a decline in higher education, in the intellectual caliber, I think is taking place right now. And that's also disturbing. I think in the 60s era was an era of political awakening for people, and that impacted the academy. I think you had critical thinking standard that came in more. I think there were a lot of good professors. I know in the foreign policy field, there were a lot of good critical analysis of U.S. foreign policy. They came out of that era. Then there was a backlash in the more recent era. And this is, yeah, just a product of growing corporate and government control over higher education. And the true purpose of education, again, as what you're saying, is to encourage independent thinking of students, to develop their own independent critical thinking analysis, and to be able to develop good argument where they back up their analysis. Of their critiquing a book, they have to do it thoughtfully, and then that should be, if that's done, that should be an A grade, whatever the position. And I always try and be fair to the student. I don't have to agree with them. If they present a good argument, a good analysis, and marshal good evidence for their point of view, they should get an A grade. Now, as far as this misinformation review, yeah, this is just awful. At the Kennedy School, and I in researching it, I found it was funded by the Ford Foundation. And these foundations are very sinister. They have the goal, basically neutering the left in the United States, and they fund a lot of things that go on campuses, including they're funding this journal out of Harvard Kennedy School that's called the Misinformation Review. And well, we know the CIA promotes a lot of misinformation in favor of wars, and we know a lot of U.S. Presidents have done that, but that's not the focus of this journal. It's all about exposing Russian misinformation and public health misinformation. So there are a lot of articles, I think, about the COVID and misinformation, by Robert Kennedy and people who are critical of the official COVID narrative. So it's basically just I found that their articles promoted misinformation. They've been promoting wrong-headed facts, and it was fitting a government narrative and government agenda of going after the Russians and going after skeptics of vaccines and the COVID official COVID narrative. And it's not scholarship; it was pure propaganda, and a lot of it, again, was misinformation. And they're attacking conspiracy theorists. And one article brought up the Seth Rich case, curiously, which we know there are a lot of shady things in that, and we don't have to go into that case now, but it's very legitimate to question that case. And that, clearly it looks like he was murdered for political reasons, and he may be the key to unraveling the whole Russiagate fraud. But this article is, attacking anybody who questioned the official narrative that he was killed in the robbery as a purveyor of misinformation. So this seems to be just out of the Soviet Union, a propaganda publication masqueraded as a liberal journal run out of a prestigious university. It's not scholarship. And I said in the article, that I did have a lot of good professors and learned a lot, but I tortured myself and read through several issues of that journal, and it was torture. And I said, I learned nothing. And if I'm a student from these professors, I'm learning nothing from these professors. That's not an education, regurgitating government propaganda and attacking people who are questioning things as conspiracy theorists. That's not education. So this is what's going on now.
And we're up to number 9. Number 9. Meet a forgotten CIA critic who presently, I can't say this word, presently characterized the agency as a cancer in his 1970s book.
Well, yeah, I recommend this book. I don't think it's actually accessible because they barred it from publication in the United States. It was printed in India. You can get it through the University of British Columbia library, I think. They'll send you a photocopied version of it. David Kahn was served under General Douglas MacArthur. His specialty was actually propaganda. He worked under Douglas MacArthur printing propaganda pamphlets in the U.S. military occupation of Japan. And then he was a target of McCarthyism. They accused him of left-wing sympathies, and I think he was purged from that position. And he wrote for the Far East Economic Review for a lot of years, and he covered Southeast Asian politics and U.S. what they refused to cover at Stanford and other universities he covered in his time. He taught about and studied U.S. imperial intervention in Southeast Asia, in Korea and Japan and Vietnam. And he looked at and he became an expert in the role of corporate foundation, like the Asia Foundation, in promoting propaganda in those countries, disguised as, for economic foreign aid or educational aid. And he exposed the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, and their role behind all kinds of programs, and how they were corrupting education in those countries and in the United States. He discussed in his book how they funded all these academics, like some of the kind I was describing, who promote these rigid Cold Warrior, anti-communist, pro-U.S. foreign policy views. And people don't realize it's propaganda because they're publishing books, and people think it's an objective book, an expose of the communist system, but really it's CIA funded through these foundations. And he has a lot of information. His book is a treasure trove for historians and in understanding how the CIA corrupts academic life. And he's the one who referred to these academics as intellectual incest and rape. And yes, some of what he was describing in his book, published in 1970, was later revealed in a book by Francis Stoner Saunders called The Cultural Cold War, the British journalist who exposed the CIA's role behind the Congress of Cultural Freedom and how they supported a lot of anti-communist intellectuals, basically steered. They targeted left intellectuals and steered them into more right-wing positions because that was a way to neuter any anti-war movement and draw people on the left. And it's propaganda targeting the educated sectors of society and to get them to embrace this anti-communist worldview. So his book is a very valuable historical resource, and there's been a few more studies like the Saunders study that built off what he was writing about in 1970. And now this David Price book on the Asia Foundation gives us a lot more detail about the Asia Foundation and its connection to the CIA and its support for academics in the Cold War. So we have the knowledge, a lot more knowledge now in those books, that we can understand how the system developed in the Cold War and is playing out continuously through the new Cold War, and how these agencies and foundations continue to support academic program. Because Stanford, I looked at their funding for like their foreign policy and Southeast Asian departments, and they get funding from the Ford Foundation as well as American corporations. And so these professors are not objective really or independent. They have funding and they steer clear of certain topics and they present certain analysis. And a lot of those professors, you can find links to the CIA. Like in Stanford, I was following this guy, Ji-Wook Shin, who supported that award to Netra News. He's a professor in the Southeast Asian department. And I saw a YouTube speech he gave, and he was announcing a speaker. It was an event where they brought a speaker to campus. And he said, "Oh, my friends at the CIA, they brought a CIA analyst. They had a whole big program on the North Korea threat, and they brought the CIA analyst. And then Ji-Wook Shin, this supposedly objective liberal, professor, introducing the speaker. I found this on the YouTube. Said, "Oh, my friends at the CIA said he was the best CIA analyst on North Korea." Well, why does he have friends at the CIA? And then if you look at his publications, he writes only about the North Korea threat. And,
we got to wrap it up, Jeremy. Please tell our audience how they can follow your work and purchase your book. And I notice over your shoulder that a book has replaced Clinton, and it's titled Syria. Can you talk for a moment about that? We are running a little over.
Yeah, this book is called Syria, Anatomy of Regime Change. And to fit with the theme of this show, there's a chapter, and it's co-written with Dan Kovalik. And one of the chapters that I wrote was on intellectuals and their support, the crucial role that they played in the regime change operation in Syria. And these intellectuals, what they would do is they follow the norm of the mainstream media in demonizing the target of regime change, Bashar al-Assad, and they attack independent journalists and authors like the Max Blumenthal's as Assad lovers and Assad agents. And that's the role that they play. And they were getting stuff published on more left-wing websites to attack these people And that's by design because they're targeting the left and the educated audience. And going back to World War One,
Wait, no, let's not go back. We can't go back.
But
We
U.S.
can only go
propaganda, they
forward.
target the educated classes. That's why intellectuals are so important.
We can only go forward. Okay. So where can they buy Syria? Is it on Amazon?
Yes, it's published with Baraka Books, and you can purchase it on Amazon.
Okay, great. And they can also find Jeremy's articles on Covert Action Magazine and also on his Substack and Uncontrolled Opposition. We also have a Substack too, and I do too. I finally created one. You can find me, Gloria Guillo, on Substack also. Okay, so the opinions you hear are ours and that of our guests, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. That wraps up our show for today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov. Remember to like and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Please find us on Substack, Twitter, and Podbeam. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
All right. There we go. That was pretty good. I can't believe you got through
We
all
did
9
nine.
articles.
We did
All of
nine.
them.
I could talk for another 2 or 3 hours on this topic.
I know, you could.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you could have done like probably an hour on each of those articles.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're close
But no,
to
you
it.
did a good job, Gloria. Yeah. Hopefully I didn't talk too
Jamie
much.
was prodding me. He's like, he's got to do about 8 minutes of article. He's
No, it was
spending
like 5 minutes an article.
5 minutes, and
he'd
he's already
did 8 minutes on the first one. I'm like, we got to speed
yeah.
it up
He
here.
was prodding me. Thank you, Jamie.
So that was
He's kicking my leg under the table, so to speak.
I'm trying to.
But you
trying
did
to keep
great,
us on pace.
Jeremy. You were just like, boom.
That's what I tell
I
people,
enjoy that
Jeremy.
topic. I wish it could be better, but unfortunately, it's an important reality that more people should be aware of, I think, because yeah.
We've also done a show with Jeremy and Dan Kovalik and Danny Shaw. And, basically, all three of you guys were sidelined because you supported all different things. You supported Ukraine, not Ukraine. You supported.
I think they just don't like critical thinking,
Right.
and it really challenge and get the students thinking. And these are charismatic, friendly guys. I mean, I'm sure they're popular with students. Dan is such a nice guy. I imagine the students love him.
Yeah.
So that makes him ever more dangerous.
And Danny Shaw too. I know him both.
And Danny knows how to relate to people well, and youth, and kind of like he's kind of got this tough guy. So I bet he can relate to a certain kind of student really well. So I mean that makes him a real threat because the students like him, and and then it's teaching critical thinking. Yeah, I mean because we don't really teach. Oh, you have to think this way or adopt this position on this issue. It's just more a way of thinking critically about society and government, and that does threaten them. So
yeah. Well, when I tell people about you, I'd say that you're a machine. You're just a researching machine. you can. It's like you just almost absorb these books, and then you're able to regurgitate all these facts and the information that you learn from that.
And thank you. I appreciate it.
It's amazing. It's
astonishing. I enjoy doing it. That's what I enjoy doing. So.
I
appreciate that.
Just want to
do
a shout out to Dan Kovalik since we've just discussed him. Basically, the president of Colombia has tweeted that Dan will be his lawyer. And Dan, I think today is like Wednesday. I think he's on his way to Colombia right now, and he's putting together a team.
Is that because the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro?
You see,
I saw that on Facebook. Yeah, I thought Colombia.
No, not university. No.
Wow.
The country. Yeah, the country.
Yeah.
Because Petro.
Well, because they were applying sanctions on him ridiculously. He's made a lot of sensible suggestions, and I don't even think he's that radical either. I mean, he's a very sensible guy.
Yeah.
And that's great for Dan. Yeah, he's a terrific guy. Yeah. Besides being a great writer, he's written a lot of books, and he's done a lot of amazing investigation. He's traveled to numerous countries.
So
that's what I said when they
shout out. Dan, we wish you the best.
Because I
Safe
mean, when they
travels.
fired him, it's amazing to have a professor. I would want a professor. He's been to the Donbass. He's been to Syria because he's the co-author.
Mhm.
He did all the Syrian chapter because he's spent a lot of time in Syria. Could provide a Syrian perspective, and that's really very valuable for students to learn. That's real education, and he has some real insights. So that's really sad that they removed him from that school. Somebody. It's and that it's contributing to dumbing down and a decline not just in the in moral standard but also the educational quality is going way downhill. And I think
Well,
Samantha Power, the product of it, her book is a very low intellectual caliber.
there is a silver lining here to this, Jeremy. Like in the past, when they would silence a professor by firing them, that was it. But now a lot of these professors are taken to YouTube,
Yeah,
and you can still get them. And there's other people who aren't really even professors who are almost as good. And like there's people that I feel like if this was my professor, some of the people I watch on YouTube, if this was my professor, I would never want to skip their class. But
yeah,
I mean, I'm a product of this university system that we talked about today, and I learned everything through the lens of all the propaganda. And it wasn't until after I graduated graduate school where I started realizing I need to learn about some of these subjects on my own. I mean, and I was already well into my 30s at that point. So,
yeah.
like, I mean, and I had to undo all the propaganda that I was fed, and that's basically been my
Well, we're
focus over the
still
last 10 to
undoing
15
it
years.
every day. Jeremy and I talk often to plan for the show, and we're always like just amazed at like what we believed, and now we don't believe it. I think we've even talked about this, like the moon landing. I believe the moon landing, and now I don't. I mean, there's just so
So
many
now I
things.
have questions. I still believe it happened, but I have questions. There's a lot of weird
You're
stuff
so
about it.
you're so hopeful. You have such hopeful thinking, But every day, it's like another Santa Claus is,
Yeah, well,
or
that's
Easter
why
Bunny
I
is
like doing
dead.
research and reading because, yeah, I challenge my own prejudice and assumption. Most things I believe end up being discredited when I do research on the topic or read some books by somebody who's really investigated it.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll tell you on a personal level, what hurt me the most was understanding Tavistock and rock music and how that was a way of undermining my generation. And that hit me real hard. And I remember when I was writing songs, and I initially thought that like all these stupid songs like Take Me Down to Paradise City where the grass is green and the girls are pretty. I thought all of these
I love that
terrible
one.
lyrics were just because the bands were stupid. I had no idea that it was because anything of value could not be published or recorded. And I tried to do my thing, and then ran into, oh gee, you can't really do anything because they don't want you to. You have to stay in a box. You have to can only sing about sex if you're a female. As long as you say, or if as long as you sing about sex, you're okay as a female. If you try to sing about politics, or the world.
Well, it's changed a bit, and you just brought up "Appetite for Destruction" by Guns N' Roses, which is one of my favorite albums of all time. So,
I like Guns N' Roses. I mean, I loved all the hard rock music growing up, and it's been a big thing. But so I really understanding the influence of Tavistock, especially on the '60s, and on the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, and understanding how this was to kind of form a wedge, and to, I mean, even just looking at sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, that is not really productive for society. I mean, you really want people, not tuning out and dropping acid. You really want you want people focused and demanding, what their generation needs,
right, we need more songs like for "Fortunate Son."
Well, yeah, and Gloria, I have an article that we can do a show in January, maybe February, because I have an article, it'll probably be in January, on Timothy Leary
oh yeah,
and how he had actually admitted that he worked for the CIA to get all the 60 youth to take acid and to turn them away from political activism.
yeah. Yeah. And, I mean, I believed that stuff when I was in high school. And, anyway, so that was one of the things that ripped off that I went, ouch. For the most part, I'm just kind of winging it. What I see today, if we have a second here, is, this whole Mamdani thing. It's just, he's funded by Soros. We're talking a color revolution, people. I mean, like, this is not grassroots. And it's so sad, but I know so many people, and they're just jumping up and down about Madami and how great he is, and this is wonderful.
Well,
And
it's only the
it's
mayor of
so,
New York. I mean, that's not going to
Yeah.
make a huge difference.
oh,
One person as a mayor, even if he was great.
No, it does make a difference because
I mean, it makes some difference,
it
but
makes a
it's
big
not going to.
difference. New York is a pivotal city in the United
Yeah,
States.
well, that's
Probably
true.
the most pivotal.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got Chicago, LA, you've got New York, and New York is definitely, in the lead. And so it's just sad that people are hoodwinked, that you say the word socialist and everyone's like, oh great, he's a wonderful guy. Then you find out he is financed by Soros. And folks, Soros is the one that does all the color revolutions in the world. And why does Soros do it? He does it to tank the economies because he makes money shorting economies. And anytime you have strife and you have problems, you have the potential for a shorting economy. And look at the
Well,
root
anyway, we can do
things.
another episode on that. I don't want to get into that now.
We're not going to get into it. I'm done. I just had to say
We can
that.
do a
but,
show on that if you want.
I've written a few articles on this topic. It's on Substack, and it's also on Uncontrolled Opposition Substack. So you can take a
I
look.
mean, I think people should temper their excitement for Mamdani, but I can't fault people for being excited of seeing Cuomo losing. Like, because what was the alternative? Was I think it's just absolutely terrible. And
Well, we all have
like
opinions.
your options are awful either way.
We all have opinions, but I don't like to see people misled. And and when they flaunt the socialist word, people are like, "Oh, he's so good. He wants to do this."
Well,
let me tell you, folks.
I've got to
he's not gonna
run,
do
so I don't
anything.
want to get into other
All right,
topics
let's
now.
go.
So,
All right, bye
Okay.
everybody. See you next
take
week.
care.
all right. Thank
Thanks,
you guys.
Jamie. Take
Thanks.
care.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you everybody for watching Uncontrolled Opposition. I know I could talk for another hour, but we're gonna get out of here, and we'll be back next week with another episode. And tune in. Thanks for watching. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
See